Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
And I think Marco did a great job in Munich.
I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and this is Trumponomics, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, and what on earth is going to happen next. And this week, as we heard at the top of the show, President Donald Trump thinks Secretary of State Marco Rubio did a great job at the Munich Security Conference. But how did European leaders and the world more broadly interpret his message? And where did the Munich summit leave us in relation to Europe and its future, relations with China? Well, I know it happened a few days ago, but I thought for once we could linger a little on that conference because it is a good opportunity to take stock of where we are and also to show off the fact that our editor-in-chief had the only sit-down interview with Marco Rubio. And we also had our head of geoeconomics, Jenny Welch, in attendance, launching lots of exciting research. So I am joined by John Micklethwait, Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg News, and Jenny Welch, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst for Bloomberg Economics. John, as I mentioned, you had the only sit-down interview with him. What were your kind of personal impressions? Had you met him before? What did you think of him?
I had met him a long time ago when he was more in the kind of, I suppose, neoconservative mould than the I love J.D. Vance mould. I thought it was interesting. I think you said style and substance. I think if you look at the substance of what he said, he was quite careful not to digress too much from the kind of Trump agenda. But in terms of style, it was said way more nicely and also with a lot of kind of common cultural heritage. You know, he really believed these things about the Rolling Stones and beer and Christopher Columbus. That's very much part of the kind of Rubio worldview, is that there's this great common civilization and we're much stronger together in that way. And that's I think the main thing that came across. And I think the other bit is a degree of self-confidence. I mean, remember when he went into the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about, little Marco's gone to join. Actually, as the years have gone by, he has become a much stronger, more significant figure. And you see his fingerprints all over things to do with Venezuela, most obviously, in the Americas, but just quite cleverly, deciding which bits he's going to have an input into and which one, some of the Middle East stuff he's handed over to Witkoff and things, but he's more popular with the State Department people than you might have expected a few years ago. He's on an up, and people are relentlessly thinking about, the presidential side, where you could end out of the Trump cabinet. Him and J.D. Vance are the two obvious people who could head in a presidential direction.
Jenny, we've had Chris Kennedy on the show a few times in the past. Recently, he was talking about Venezuela. He works for you now as a geoeconomics analyst, but before, up until last summer, he was working for Rubio in the State Department's policy planning unit. Very much to John's point, he wrote an essay for Bloomberg highlighting that he was one of the few figures in the administration who'd found a line somehow between the America Firsters and the more neoconservative wings of the president's coalition. Do you think that's going to come under more strain? Did you see any of the strains in evidence in Munich?
Yeah, I would agree with Chris's take there. And by the way, he also has a really great profile of Rubio available on the terminal for terminal clients as well. And this is something he's highlighted too. Rubio has played his cards exceptionally well over the last year or so. He's been given far more responsibilities. He's not just Secretary of State. He's also National Security Advisor. He's leveraged that to his advantage and is especially played a really strong hand in U.S. policy towards Venezuela, which Trump regards as incredibly successful, especially after the operation to oust Maduro. That being said, and this is often a law in Washington, the more successful you are, the more powerful you are, the more risky your position can be. And especially as you start to gain prominence, right? One of Rubio's, I think, tactics over the last year has been to make sure that he doesn't steal the spotlight, that he has been very careful to, follow and implement policy and pay respect to the president as kind of the strategist in chief. And one of the risks that I think he faces is the more his star has risen, the more attention there will be to him personally. And that can be a very tricky thing to navigate in Washington, but especially in the Trump administration.
So Jenny, did you find they sort of focused on the tone of the speech and much less on the pretty uncompromising and still quite conditional approach to the transatlantic relationship that was actually in the small print of what he said?
What was interesting to me is that there was widespread recognition. You heard this from every European speaker who took the main stage. You heard it in the side events. You heard it in the lounges and in the hallways, too, of the idea that the world is changing. Europe needs to step up, not just because of American pressure to do so, but also because of the friction with the United States and concerns about reliability there. What still seemed to be very much a nascent conversation is how does that actually happen? There didn't seem to be very many clear paths forward. There was still a lot of discussion about internal divisions. And then obviously, especially for EU members, there's additional bureaucratic hurdles to overcome that get in the way of everything from figuring out how do we develop a more independent, self-reliant defense industrial base to how do we address critical mineral reliance on China issues when we have to work more together as a union, and the United States is kind of a unitary actor that can move much faster. So that to me was kind of this interesting contradiction of a real strong shared awareness of the issue, but still not a clear sense of the way to address it.
That does tend to be the rule with Europe. They're really, really good at understanding the problem and analysing the problem, slightly less good at solving it. John, we're going to play a bit of your interview, but I guess we should ask you, what were the headlines you wanted?
I think actually the honest truth is I went in there thinking he'd made quite an impressive speech. Did, I think, pull on lots of issues that matter a lot to Rubio and which have always mattered to him. And yet he managed to do it in a way that wouldn't annoy Donald Trump, but also please the Europeans. So I tried to push him more into, what does this mean in practice? What do you actually expect the Europeans to do?
Let's hear a bit of it.
Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, thank you for talking to Bloomberg. You've just made this rather remarkable speech where you talked about the destiny of Europe and America always being intertwined. You talked about an alliance which has stretched all the way culturally from Michelangelo to the Rolling Stones, a first, I suspect, for a Secretary of State, but a culture that has bled and died together. But the very common theme of your speech was the need to share the burden, the need for Europe and America to do things together, which was slightly different from the Vice President last year. Were you kind of offering a carrot where perhaps he was offering a stick?
I think it's the same message. I think what the Vice President said last year very clearly was that Europe had made a series of decisions internally that were threatening to the alliance and ultimately to themselves, not because we hate Europe or we don't like Europeans, but because what is it that we fight for? What is it that binds us together? And ultimately, it's the fact that we are both heirs to the same civilization. And it's a great civilization. And it's one we should be proud of. It's one that's contributed extraordinarily to the world. And it's one, frankly, upon which America is built. From our language to our system of government, to our laws, to the food we eat, to the name of our cities and towns, all of it deeply linked to this Western civilization and culture that we should be proud of, and it's worth defending. And ultimately, that's the point. It is because we understand that ultimately our own fate will be intertwined with what happens with Europe. We want Europe to survive. We want Europe to prosper because we're interconnected in so many different ways and because our alliance is so critical. But it has to be an alliance of allies that are capable and willing to fight for who they are and what's important.
Do you see a parallel? You seem to see a parallel between the Cold War, which I think I would argue that America beat the Soviet Union because it had a common idea and it had allies on its side. You're now in a struggle with China. As people say, you've often been a hawk on that subject. You're in a struggle with China. Do you think you absolutely need Europe to be able to?
Yeah, I would say two things. The first, the mentions of the Cold War to remind people of everything we've achieved together in the past, in times when there was doubt. But it's also a reminder that at the end of that era, when we won the Cold War, there was this euphoria that led us to make some terrible decisions that have now left us vulnerable and deindustrialized the West. It left us increasingly dependent on others, including China, for our critical supplies, and that needs to be reversed in order to safeguard us. And so I do think, yes, it would be ideal to have a Western supply chain that is free from extortion from anyone. So I think we do have a vested interest in that regard. Today is different than yesterday, but it has parallels, not in that China's the new Soviet Union, but that in our future collectively will be stronger if we work on these things together.
Various sort of allies. Mark Carney has just been to Beijing. Starmer has just been to Beijing. Merz is about to go there. Do you worry that they're beginning to drift off too much in that direction?
No, I think nation states need to interact with one another. Remember, I serve under a president that's willing to meet with anybody.
Yes.
I mean, to be frank, I'm pretty confident in saying that if the Ayatollah said tomorrow he wanted to meet with President Trump, the president would meet him, not because he agrees with the Ayatollah, but because he thinks that's the way you solve problems in the world, and he doesn't view meeting someone as a concession. Likewise, the president intends to travel to Beijing and has already met once with President Xi. And in this very forum yesterday, I met with my counterpart, the foreign minister of China. So we expect nation states to interact with one another. In the end, we expect nation states to act in their national interest. I don't think that is that in no way runs counter to our desire to work together on things that we share in common or threats we face in common. But I don't think visiting Beijing or meeting with the Chinese is on the contrary. I think it would be irresponsible for great powers not to have relationships and talk through things, and to the extent possible, avoid unnecessary conflict. But there will be areas we'll never agree on, and those are the areas that I hope we can work together on.
So you think the rupture that many people have spoken about is illusory? That hasn't happened yet?
But there's no, I mean, even as I speak to you now, there are U.S. troops deployed here on this continent on behalf of NATO. There are still all kinds of cooperation that go on at every level, from intelligence to commercial and economic. The links remain. I think there is a readjustment that's happening, because I think we have to understand that we want to reinvigorate. This alliance has to be about different things than it's been in the past, because the challenges of the 21st century are different than the challenges of the 20th.
The place where that's being most obviously tested at the moment is Ukraine. You see all these numbers from the front where the Ukrainians do seem to be doing better in terms of what's happening to the Russians. Do you think Ukraine, or do you think Russia is still winning that war, or where do you place it militarily?
I think that's a difficult war to say anyone is winning. The Russians are losing 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers a week.
Yes.
Not wounded, dead. Ukraine has suffered extraordinary damage, including, overnight, and again, to its energy infrastructure, and it will take billions of dollars and years to rebuild that country. So I don't think anyone can claim to be winning it. I think that both sides are suffering tremendous damage, and we'd like to see the war come to an end. It's a senseless war, in our view. The president believes that very deeply. He believes the war would have never happened had he been president at the time. So we're doing two things. So obviously we continue. Look, we don't provide arms to Russia. We provide arms to Ukraine. We don't sanction Ukraine. We sanction Russia. But at the same time, we find ourselves in a unique position of serving as probably the only nation on earth that can bring the two sides to discuss the potential for ending this war on negotiated terms. And it's an obligation we won't walk away from, because we think it's a very unique one to have. It may not come to fruition, unfortunately. I hope it does, and I think there are days when I feel more optimistic about it than others. But we're going to keep trying, because that is, in the end, this war will not be solved militarily. It will be, in the end, it will come to a negotiated settlement. We'd like to see that happen as soon as possible.
Secretary Marco Rubio, thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg.
Thank you.
So, John, we've talked quite a lot about Marco Rubio, but I wanted to also use this as a chance to kind of take stock of how Europe was responding to this new world that Trump has been helping to shape. And one of the issues that was discussed a lot is defense, and even talk of the sharing of the nuclear umbrella between Germany and France. That seemed like a new stage. It wasn't just they're going to spend more on defense, but they're going to actually be seriously thinking about alternatives to the US, or some kind of diversification away from the US if they're thinking about defending themselves from Russia.
There's one European leader who rather nicely told me, and I'm going to get it slightly wrong, that the way in which Europe proceeded was you have lethargy, you then have crisis, chaos, and then you end up with a suboptimal solution of sorts. And I think they're somewhere in the kind of chaos towards the suboptimal solution stage of it at the moment. I think that Greenland, no matter how often the Trump administration or people around the Trump administration try to say, oh, it really didn't matter that much, I think it really did matter. I think it struck through right into some of the main leaders in Europe, that they realized that they can't rely on America. Many of them might hope that a different administration would be more supportive. Many of them might even have looked at Rubio and thought, well, if he was running it, this would be, we could deal with this. But the idea that they can necessarily 100% rely on that, I think is now out. You've even got Germany looking at, what the nuclear options are for it. You've got Britain talking to France about its nuclear. Suddenly a lot of things are on the table that weren't there before. In terms of where they've got to on that sort of voyage, yes, you've got, Germany is going to build Europe's biggest army. You've got more money going back into defense in several different areas. But it's the sort of next stage where you get the suboptimal solutions. One really obvious point is Europe has countless defense manufacturers and different priorities in each part of different armies and different versions of tanks and different. Simplifying all that would not only save a fortune, it would also end up with a much kind of better fighting force at the end. And they don't seem to be getting there.
I mean, it was very striking to me, some of that conversation about the nuclear deterrent and sort of potential options involving the French and potentially the British, or indeed a sort of pan-European deterrent. Jenny, I was wondering, how seriously do you take that?
I think it's important to take it seriously. The other thing that comes to mind that I think is really striking here is the timing of this. This is coming after the expiration of the last major arms limitation treaty between the U.S. and Russia. New START expired earlier this month. And I think the world has yet to fully appreciate or reckon with the idea that we're going to see a new wave of nuclear proliferation. I think the Europe context is obviously unique and driven in part by these frictions with Washington, but it is taking place against the backdrop of this broader nuclear movement where I think we're going to see not just the U.S. and Russia because of the expiration of this treaty. China has already been embarking on a major nuclear weapons expansion, but also other countries. And the consequences of that for geopolitical stability and the consequences of conflict are immense. You can't get more dangerous and more impactful than nuclear conflict, right? And that's the world in which we are going to increasingly live in.
Just to follow on what Jenny said, if you remember in the Ukraine war fairly early on, there was this issue about whether Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons. And the Chinese immediately supposedly jumped on his back and said, absolutely no way. That's sort of a road we're going to pass over. I think by the same token, the idea that Germany would ever think of sort of turning to people other than America to protect it, the idea that Germany might, in the end, even consider doing it itself. This is a very different world, and it's that thing where Donald Trump has thrown a stone in the pool, and the ripples are still heading out. And again, a lot of these things may not happen, but the mere fact people are thinking about it is a really, really big deal.
Jenny, you mentioned China. And that's another thing that's changed at the Munich Security Conference. You were telling us earlier, it used to be very much focused on transatlantic ties, but you now see much more. There's more people there from Asia, and clearly there's now more focus in Europe from a kind of strategic standpoint as well as an economic standpoint on China. So, do you feel that you got a clearer sense of how Europeans were thinking about China? Because a few years ago, it would have been all about de-risking and reducing their vulnerability to China in terms of supply chains. As we discussed on the program a couple of weeks ago, now almost it's the opposite. Now people are talking about building ties with China.
Absolutely. And as you're noting there, it's very complex. Europe is really facing difficult choices on both sides. On one hand, the frictions with Washington do lead them to naturally consider the other major power in the world. On the other hand, they're extremely frustrated with China for what they see as China's ongoing support for Russia during its war in Ukraine. And this was a question that got pitched to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi after his remarks, which, by the way, they purposely put right after Rubio. So couldn't underscore more clearly the idea that there's a contrast being painted here between the United States and China as the two major powers in the world. And his response, I think, left many Europeans deeply unsatisfied, which is essentially, China remains very committed to the peace process, but no comments on, questions about supporting Russia's war machine and ongoing strong economic and strategic ties. The other challenge that Europe faces with China is pressure from Chinese exports and Chinese overcapacity. And that's something that continues to be a strain that we heard from European leaders and inside events from other Europeans as well. And again, I think it's one of those examples of a recognition of the problem, a frustration with the problem, but no clear sense of the way forward, in part because they're navigating these difficult trade-offs with Washington. And that's something I think we're going to continue to see to play out.
And John, there's been a lot of focus on the quality of speeches in recent weeks. People were very impressed by Mark Carney's speech in Davos. You were saying that you thought Rubio's speech was very good. A sort of blockbuster speech is not what you ever expect from a Chinese foreign minister. But did you get the sense that there were more substantive meetings happening behind closed doors?
There's definitely a kind of flirtation going on in that direction. And there's two bits. I mean, very clearly, privately, one of Europe's leaders, when asked what happens in Ukraine, they said very clearly that, the only three people who can stop the war in Ukraine are Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Xi Jinping. Because Xi Jinping could just simply turn off the support and then Russia would have to give in. And so I think there is a kind of realization, certainly at the top of Europe, that this is a relationship you go into carefully. It's quite interesting that Rubio, when I asked him about that, said, no, that's fine. It's completely logical that the Europeans should also have a foreign policy towards China, which is slight tension between that and what Trump has said a few times. But that was what he said. Now, you can make an argument about how long the particularly Trumpish version of foreign policy in America continues. At some point, one gets the impression, the likelihood is it is going to move away from that. And I think when it stops being quite so keen to go and beat up the Europeans and starts thinking we are in a competition with China and we're going to need allies, I think that is where there is quite a difficulty, because I think people will forgive, American leaders will forgive Europe doing stuff if it's purely just a kind of reflection to what Trump has been up to. But if you come out of it with Europe seeming to have deeper ties with China, that's going to really complicate the transatlantic relationship. So I think Europe has to be a bit careful on that, I think.
Jenny, we're going to run out of time, but I do want to just touch on, because you were presenting this research at Munich. And of course, it's a subject close to your heart because you were very focused on China and Taiwan policy when you were at the National Security Council. It's not as if the US policy towards China is completely straightforward at this point. And in fact, we are seeing a lot of mixed messages in terms of, the doing of economic deals, the sort of hard talk, but also somehow the suggestion that there's kind of less support, for example, for Taiwan. And you had, just for a sort of couple of headlines, you've highlighted in that report, you and the team, what the economic consequences would be of the US just stepping back from Asia.
Yes, absolutely. We were very fortunate that the Munich Security Conference this year chose the theme of under destruction, played quite well for our new report that looks at the potential economic consequences where conflict or break out in these major hotspots around the world, including the Taiwan Strait, where we estimate a conflict there could cost the global economy about $10 trillion. That's almost 10% of global GDP, more than the COVID pandemic, more than the global financial crisis. And candidly, that's probably a conservative estimate. When you look at the really critical role that Taiwan plays in producing advanced semiconductors that are just going into more and more things, from our smartphones to our smart home appliances to our cars, and increasingly feeding the beast of AI, right, which is also very important and increasingly important, at least in the U.S. stock market. I think the risk that we're highlighting in that report and that we're seeing in just the headlines today, right, is not necessarily that the U.S. will overtly give up Taiwan, although that's something President Xi Jinping is certainly going to be pressing for in his meeting in April with President Trump, but even just the risk of an inadvertent sort of strategic distraction from Asia, that the U.S. is being pulled into the Middle East. It's very focused on the Western Hemisphere. And when you're dealing with China that is fully focused on the Indo-Pacific and that has tremendous resources to bear, strategic distraction can become strategic defeat. So that was essentially the premise of our report. Again, played in very well to the themes that Munich had identified as well.
So, John, I wanted to ask you what might be a kind of final takeaway from Munich. You mentioned that there was, this was a real rupture, to coin a phrase, to have Germany thinking about alternatives to the US. That certainly was the feel sort of throughout most of the last year, that the feeling among Europeans was this is a lasting thing. There were the loss of trust in the US as an ally. It may have been unpredictable, but the fact that you now can't rely on the US as an ally is something that will outlast Donald Trump, just as the sort of suspicion of China from the US is potentially going to outlast Donald Trump. There were an awful lot of sort of democratic hopefuls in Munich and others and senators who all seemed to be who were at the summit and seemed to be wanting to say the opposite, that this too will pass. Do you think that the Europeans were buying that, or do you think that it is going to be very difficult for any future president to be trusted in the same way?
It's a very good question. I think the Europeans were all looking sort of hopefully towards the kind of Democrats, and this is the answer, will get us out of this mess. And I think also towards people like Glenn Youngkin, who was also there, so sort of Republican moderates, although he probably wouldn't thank me for saying that all those sort of people, yes, the Europeans were looking at them, but I think there is this sort of big debate amongst the Europeans, which in one good way is sort of coming to an end. It's been this endlessly waiting for the world after Trump. I think the good news is, because it's good for Europe, full stop, to be doing this stuff, is that Europe now has been bullied by Trump and by the possibility that some elements of Trumpery could survive Trump, into thinking we absolutely need to focus on defense. We need to actually start building things. We need to work out how to do some of the stuff with competition that they haven't done before. And if, in a weird way, one of the main consequences of Trumponomics, straightforwardly, could be the economics of Europe, because you're now finding people inside Germany, inside some of the other big countries, saying, look, we just need to get on with this stuff to do with competition in Europe. Our economy, the reason why we are so powerless when we negotiate with the Americans is that our economy is not growing anywhere near as quickly as theirs. And we need to get on with it. And some people now talking about coalitions of the willing and all those sort of things. So not taking the full 27 along with them, definitely leaving Viktor Orban behind, but also potentially leaving the French behind as well. This is that is a very different way of thinking about it. And it is, as I said, it's funny that Trumponomics, one of the main long-term consequences of Trumponomics could be what happens in Europe rather than anywhere else. And I think that is quite a sort of fundamental thing. Wait to see what happens.
I think you've given us a very elegant ending to the programme, John, not least by giving a justification for why a supposedly economic podcast would have spent half an hour talking about geopolitics.
Finally.
Because it does, the Trumponomics indeed is bleeding into all these areas. But John Micklethwait and Jennifer Welch, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Trumponomics from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders. I was joined by Bloomberg News' Editor-in-Chief, John Micklethwait, and Bloomberg Economics' Chief Geoeconomics Analyst, Jennifer Welch. Trumponomics was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andan, with help from Amy Keenan. And special thanks this week to Rachel Lewis-Krisky. To help others find the show, please rate and review it highly wherever you listen to podcasts.